This is the first video of 5 that will look at the development of the slave trade and slavery in colonial America. This video will look at the background to the American slave trade. Now, slavery was not new to Africa when the Europeans began an active slave trade. What the Europeans did was add new techniques to the old approach, sort of an idea of slavery is based on race alone. In Africa, slavery had been widespread, as in all continents. The Egyptians had enslaved whatever people they captured. Sometimes, of course, the Jewish people. You might think of the Bible. Other times, Mediterranean peoples, and at times they enslaved blacks from the south. Greeks and Romans had brought back slaves from Africa, but they didn't necessarily view slavery as degrading and used them solely for personal services. As such, they were often treated as loyal friends. Sometimes they were educated or allowed personal freedoms and allowed pretty much a decent standard of living. When the Muslims extended their influence, they had slavery as well and developed an African slave trade. They'd often ship Africans off to the Arabian Peninsula or other areas in the Islamic world, either purchased from other blacks or captured in war. Often they would seize women for harems or men for military and menial service. But once again, like the Greeks and Romans, slaves were not used primarily for the production of goods, but rather for personal services, the personal servants. Therefore, because slavery was a manifestation of wealth, not a means to it, it tended to be less harsh. It was changes taking place in Europe during the Renaissance that first brought on an interest in slavery, so I need to first give a background to the major changes taking place in Europe. We will begin with the Roman Empire. Ancient Rome had quite the advanced society and economy. They were scientifically advanced and indeed dominated the entire Mediterranean world. Ancient Rome came to a conclusion when Vandals from northern Europe sacked Rome in the 5th century, and that sort of ended what we today consider the ancient world of, Egypt and Greece and then Rome. That ended the ancient world, the ancient period. In the eastern part of the old Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire emerged. That included its capital, Constantinople, which the Romans had named, and the empire called it Byzantium, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and it remained scientifically and culturally advanced. It kept the advances of ancient Rome. But in Western Europe, the advances in learning and science, etc., was slowly lost. We entered what was known as the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. It was middle because, as we will see, it was perceived to be between the ancient world and the modern world of nation states. Anyway, people retreated into a system of feudalism. They all lived on self-sufficient manors, these large plantations owned and ruled by individual lords with their own army called knights. And most of the people on them were serfs and paid their rent to the lords who would allow them to live on the land. There was no need for slavery in the feudalism system because since there was no property or money, all the land was owned by the lords, and the serfs provided all the necessary labor. About 1,000 years ago, however, about 1000 AD or a little thereafter, what we find is that the Islamic Empire of the Middle East had captured Jerusalem, which of course was the location, the center of not only the Jewish faith, but the Christian faith. It was where Christ had died. And so the Catholic Pope in Western Europe called on the individual lords to send their knights on crusades to liberate the Christian Holy Land from the infidels. And so over a period of years, a number of different crusades were held. And this is really important because in order to get to the Middle East, these crusaders, these knights from the feudal plantations, the feudal manors, had to travel through the Byzantine Empire, which you'll recall remained advanced in science and culture. And so they were exposed to all of the things that they didn't know existed before. And when they returned back to their feudal manor, suddenly those manors didn't seem so self-sufficient anymore. They wanted things that the manors could not provide. They had expanded their worldview. This new demand for goods and services that weren't available in medieval Europe led to the formation of new trade routes, and people would go now into cities where they could find these things, and there began to be a means of exchange or money. People began to think of individual property. All of this is what we think of as the Renaissance, the rebirth of some of the science and knowledge of the ancient world. The Renaissance literally means rebirth. But this is crucial for our purposes because by having the emphasis on individual ownership of property and money and stressing the accumulation of wealth, that certainly laid the groundwork for later slavery. These trade routes were dangerous things. There would be pirates all through them, and what certain lords began to do is promise to use their knights to protect the trade routes if the traders would give a certain percentage of the profits back to the lord. And this was really important because the lords that did this would take their profits and expand their knights, and eventually they were able to take over the neighboring manor, and we begin to see the consolidation of wealth in these certain forward-thinking lords. And in time, of course, these expanding manors of these certain lords became countries, and these lords, you might start calling them kings. Well, the idea of the Renaissance of this growth of nation states trying to compete continually, the competition between these nation states for property and wealth was another bit of the groundwork for slavery. Each one was looking to cut cost in their competition for property and wealth. But by the 1400s, this trade routes that had developed were cut by another powerful Islamic empire. In 1453, the Arab-led Muslim empire conquered the Byzantine Empire and cut the trade routes that had gone all the way from Renaissance Western Europe to the Far East. And undoubtedly during this time, a few Muslim African slaves made it to Western Europe, but in Europe there was no African slavery during the Renaissance. With the trade routes cut between Western Europe and the new nation states and the Far East and India through the Byzantine Empire, some of these new kings began to think logically about other ways to get these goods and services other than the overland route through the old Byzantine Empire. And this brings me to Prince Henry the Navigator and the nation of Portugal, which was an early nation state. They assumed that if you kept going south in water on these ships around Africa, which they didn't know how far south it extended, you would theoretically be able to then get to the east. And so they began to extend further and further down the African coast. This effort was really pushed by Prince Henry the Navigator, because he was encouraging his people to undertake these explorations. Under Henry the Navigator, and they had a new type of boat called a caravel, but they were capable of carrying on long distance trade on the seas. They actually made it around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of South Africa and to India and back. And this was pivotal. It was cheaper to carry all these goods by boat, and they began a profitable trade route: nuts, fruits, olives, gold, and African crafts from some of the Africans along the west coast of Africa. These Portuguese began to establish forts along the west coast of Africa, not only to keep these trade routes just for their nation, to prevent other nations from using that same route, but also to supply their ships on their long voyages. And so they would often trade with some of the African peoples in West Africa. One of the most important of these forts was called Elmina, or the mine. These forts, like Elmina, would become critical in the growing African slave trade that I'm going to talk about. As the Portuguese moved down the West African coast and established forts for supplies, they realized that a couple of islands off the west coast of Africa, including Sao Tome and Principe, were perfect climatically for the growing of sugar, which Europe couldn't do, and sugar was a valuable commodity. They needed, however, labor to produce this sugar, which was a very laborious crop. And so what they ended up doing was beginning to nab Africans on the west coast of Africa and take them offshore to these islands and make them slaves working on the plantations to produce sugar there. This was one of the first modern examples of African slavery. The Portuguese sugar plantations on Sao Tome and Principe were large operations, very similar to the type of thing that would later develop on the American South. It was brutal work, and many of these slaves died in the heat and labor. With the heat and labor, the Portuguese did in the late 1400s try to bring African slaves to Portugal, but the effort really never succeeded. They tried taking as many as 700 to 800 annually by the late 1400s. The Portuguese soon adopted a justification for their slavery. They used their faith, Christianity. They said the slaves in Africa were heathens. They weren't Christian. And as they enslaved them, they would Christianize them. They would civilize them. And therefore, slavery had the best blessings of the Christian God. As I've said, the Portuguese effort to bring African slaves back to Portugal didn't work. There was never any profitable future for African slavery in Europe. They didn't have the large untapped raw materials of the New World, which of course had yet to be discovered, and they didn't have, therefore, a lot of labor needs. Rather than labor, you needed workers, skilled workers in shipyards and shops. And they tried having some small number of African slaves come back and doing that, but that required them to be trained, and it just wasn't as profitable. There was plenty of cheap labor in Europe because as the feudalism declined during the Renaissance, the old feudal lords would often fence off their properties. They would enclose their properties so as to raise sheep. Raising sheep was cheaper than the old agriculture of the manors. And because raising sheep required less labor than growing crops, the old feudal lords would simply kick the remaining serfs, the remaining peasants, off their land. And these peasants would flood the cities that were growing in the Renaissance, and they provided cheap labor for anybody that needed labor. So there really wasn't much need for slavery in the new nation states of Europe as they emerged out of the Renaissance. This concludes the first of 5 on the development of slave trade in America.